In May 1941, German High Command launches Operation Rheinübung and releases the Bismarck to attack Atlantic convoys. This ship has the power to tip the balance of the war at sea, ultimately starving Britain into submission. It is up to HMS Hood and the Royal Navy to stop the Bismarck.
6,000 meters beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a secret has slept for 8 decades. A leather notebook, decayed but intact, holds a message that could rewrite history. Shadows in the water, they are not ours. What did the author mean? And how could the Bismarck, the most feared battleship of World War II, end up on the ocean floor almost untouched, when every record says it was obliterated? This is more than a sinking. This is a mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about one of history's deadliest naval battles, the unsinkable fortress. Picture a floating fortress, 823 feet of German engineering, 50,000 tons of steel, 8 massive 15-inch guns that could fire shells weighing as much as a small car over 21 miles with devastating accuracy.
Bismarck 8 15-inch guns.
Armor plating 13 inches thick, protecting every vital section. The Bismarck wasn't just a battleship. It was a weapon designed to terrorize the Atlantic and strangle Britain into submission. On May 24, 1941, it proved exactly how deadly it was. The Bismarck encountered HMS Hood, the pride of the British fleet. What happened next shocked the world.
May 24, 1941. The most powerful warship afloat, the German battleship Bismarck and heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, exchange fire with the pride of the British Navy. HMS Hood, 1,700-pound armor-piercing shell plunges through Hood.
One shell, one perfect shot. It plunged through Hood's thin deck armor and detonated inside the ammunition magazine. The explosion literally broke the ship in half. HMS Hood sank in less than 3 minutes. 1,415 men died. Only 3 survived. Britain's greatest warship, destroyed in an instant. Winston Churchill's response was immediate and absolute. Find the Bismarck, sink it, use every ship, every plane, every resource available. Nothing else matters. The hunt was on. For nearly 24 hours, the German battleship played cat and mouse with the entire British Navy, slipping through fog and darkness toward the safety of French-occupied ports. Victory was within reach, and then came the biplanes. The Swordfish torpedo bombers were ancient relics, slow fabric-covered aircraft that looked like they belonged in World War I. Most of their torpedoes missed or bounced off the Bismarck's armor, but one torpedo, fired by one desperate pilot, struck the ship's stern and jammed both rudders hard to port. In an instant, everything changed. The unsinkable fortress could no longer steer. It began moving in a slow, inevitable circle away from safety and directly into the path of the British battleships closing in for the kill. There would be no escape. Admiral Lütjens knew it. His crew knew it. The only question left was how the Bismarck would meet its end. The impossible wreck. When Robert Ballard's expedition reached Bismarck's final resting place in 1989, they expected to find devastation. After all, the historical record was clear. British battleships Rodney and King George V had pounded the German ship with hundreds of shells for nearly 2 hours. Torpedoes from destroyers had struck repeatedly. The superstructure had been turned into flaming wreckage. Survivors described a hell of fire and steel where men died by the dozens every minute. The Bismarck had taken more punishment than almost any warship in history before finally sinking. So Ballard's team prepared themselves to document a battlefield. A shattered hull, massive holes torn in the armor, evidence of catastrophic damage that would explain how such a powerful ship had been destroyed. That's not what they found. The Bismarck was lying upright on the slope of an extinct underwater volcano, nearly 16,000 feet below the surface. But instead of wreckage, they saw a ship that looked almost pristine. The hull was intact. The armor belt showed only minor damage. Ballard counted just 8 significant holes in the main armor above the waterline. 8, after 2 hours of point-blank bombardment by 2 of Britain's most powerful battleships. And below the waterline, where torpedoes were supposed to have ripped the ship open, there was nothing. No catastrophic breaches. No massive tears in the hull. The Bismarck's underwater armor was essentially untouched. This made no sense. The official British account claimed their ships had battered the Bismarck into submission, destroying its ability to fight and ultimately sinking it through overwhelming firepower. But the physical evidence told a completely different story. Yes, the superstructure was devastated. The upper decks were a twisted mess of metal, but the ship's armored core, the part that was supposed to keep it afloat, was barely scratched. So how did it sink? This contradiction breathed new life into a claim that German survivors had been making for decades. A claim that British and American historians had dismissed as propaganda and pride. The survivors said the Bismarck wasn't sunk by British guns. They said the crew scuttled it themselves. Think about what that means. The word scuttle sounds almost gentle, but it describes an act of desperation. Opening valves to flood your own ship, setting demolition charges in the hull, deliberately destroying the thing you've spent months or years serving on because capture is unthinkable. German naval tradition held that a warship should never fall into enemy hands intact. Better to send it to the bottom yourself than let the enemy parade it as a prize. But could the crew really have scuttled a 50,000-ton battleship while under heavy fire? And more importantly, could they prove it? For decades, this debate raged in naval history circles. British historians pointed to the overwhelming firepower their ships had brought to bear. German survivors insisted they had opened the seacocks and set charges before abandoning ship. Both sides had evidence. Both sides had witnesses. But neither side could prove definitively what had happened in those final chaotic moments. The truth was 3 miles underwater, sealed in darkness and crushing pressure, waiting for technology to catch up with mystery. When Ballard's team examined the hull in detail, they noticed something crucial. The decks below the main armored deck had been crushed downward by 10 to 13 feet. This wasn't battle damage. This was structural collapse caused by massive internal flooding. The weight of water filling the lower compartments had overwhelmed the ship's internal framework before it sank. This was consistent with scuttling. If the crew had deliberately flooded multiple compartments simultaneously, the resulting weight would have crushed the interior structure exactly as Ballard's team observed. The British bombardment had rendered the Bismarck combat ineffective, destroying its ability to fight or communicate. But the bombardment hadn't sunk the ship. The ship had sunk from the inside out. Ballard's evidence strongly suggested the German survivors had been telling the truth all along. But suggestions aren't proof. Theories aren't facts. What the investigators needed was a smoking gun. A piece of evidence so clear, so undeniable, that it would settle the question once and for all. They needed to get inside the ship, specifically inside the command center where the final orders would have been given. The problem was that getting inside the wreck at that depth was nearly impossible. The pressure at 16,000 feet is over 7,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a human body instantly. The corridors inside the ship were a maze of twisted metal, collapsed decks, and dangling cables. One wrong move and a remotely operated vehicle could be trapped or destroyed, but the potential reward was worth the risk. If they could reach the command center, they might find documentation, logs, orders, something that would tell them exactly what happened. What they found was impossible: a leather notebook, the artifact that shouldn't exist. Let me explain why this discovery was so shocking. The Bismarck sank on May 27, 1941. It had been on fire. Shells had been exploding across every surface. The ship had capsized as it went down, rolling over before hitting the ocean floor. Then it slid along the muddy slope of an underwater volcano before coming to rest in its final position. And through all of that violence, through 80 years of crushing pressure and near-freezing temperatures, through the slow decay that turns steel into rust and wood into paste, this notebook survived. Not just survived, it remained legible. The remotely operated vehicle called Jake had squeezed through a blown-out porthole and navigated the pitch-black interior using lights and sonar. The command center was a tomb of twisted metal and corroded equipment. But behind the compass binnacle, protected by the heaviest armor on the ship, something had been wedged into a space that kept it from being swept away. A small, dark object. When Jake's cameras focused on it, the team watching from the surface couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a notebook, swollen with water, warped by pressure, but incredibly, miraculously, impossibly intact. The leather binding had protected the pages. The oil that had leaked from hydraulic systems throughout the ship had created a preservative coating. The absence of oxygen at that depth meant bacteria couldn't decompose the organic material. It was a perfect storm of preservation that shouldn't have been possible, but somehow was. They couldn't retrieve it. Any attempt to physically grasp the notebook would likely destroy both the artifact and the expensive ROV. Instead, they did the only thing they could do. They photographed it. High-definition cameras captured every visible detail, and when they enhanced the images back on the surface, they could read German script. Frantic, hurried, the handwriting of someone writing under enormous stress. Most of the ink had bled or faded, but several lines were still legible, and what those lines said would haunt everyone who read them. The notebook appeared to be a log kept by an officer on the bridge, probably the navigation officer or someone in a similar position. The entries were terse, noting course changes, damage reports, the kind of information that would help reconstruct the battle if anyone survived to tell the tale. But the final entry was different. It was personal, emotional. The handwriting became shakier, less controlled. This wasn't an officer recording data. This was a man facing death and needing to write something down before the ocean claimed him forever. The legible portions confirmed what German survivors had been saying for decades. The admiral had released the crew from their duties. Demolition charges had been set on a timed countdown. Orders had been given to open the seacocks and flood the lower compartments. The scuttling was real. The survivors hadn't been lying or exaggerating. They had deliberately sunk their own ship to prevent its capture. This was the smoking gun historians had been looking for. Proof written in the final moments by someone who was there. Someone who knew he was about to die and wanted the truth recorded. But then came the last line. The one that makes no sense. The one that has spawned a dozen theories and solved nothing. Shadows in the water. They are not ours. That's it. That's all it says. No explanation. No elaboration. Just those 6 words, and then nothing. The notebook ends. The ship sinks. And we're left with a question that shouldn't exist in a story about World War II naval combat. What shadows? And why did the officer feel compelled to note that they weren't German? What lurked beneath? Let's explore the possibilities, because this is where history crosses into something stranger. The most rational explanation is psychological. Battle fatigue. Stress. The human mind under extreme duress can play terrible tricks. The officer had been fighting for his life for 2 days. He'd watched friends die. He'd seen his ship torn apart by shells. He knew he was probably going to die in the next few minutes. Under those conditions, hallucinations are not just possible but likely. The shadows in the water could have been nothing more than visual distortions caused by trauma and fear. Phantom images conjured by a brain struggling to process unimaginable horror. This explanation is clean, rational, comfortable. It allows us to close the book on the mystery and file it under wartime stress. But it doesn't account for one crucial detail. The officer specifically wrote that the shadows were not ours. Think about that distinction. If you're hallucinating, you don't typically note whether your hallucinations belong to one side or another. You just see things that aren't there. But this officer took the time, in what he knew were possibly his last moments alive, to make it clear that whatever he was seeing in the water, it wasn't German. That suggests he was observing something external, something real. So what could it have been? The next most logical answer is submarines. German U-boats were in the area. U-556 had reportedly attempted to come to the Bismarck's aid but lacked the torpedoes to engage the British fleet effectively. The shadows could have been submarines moving through the dark water. But again, why would the officer write, "not ours," if he was seeing German submarines trying to help? Unless he wasn't seeing German submarines at all. British submarines were also operating in the Atlantic. Could they have been circling the dying Bismarck like sharks around wounded prey? Possibly. But British submarine doctrine at the time emphasized staying hidden and avoiding detection at all costs. Surfacing or operating near a massive surface battle would have been suicidal. The British had destroyers and battleships on scene doing the job. They didn't need submarines. So if the shadows weren't German and probably weren't British, what were they? This is where the theories start to get uncomfortable. Throughout World War II, pilots on both sides reported strange phenomena, fast-moving lights that followed aircraft, objects that defied physics. The Allies called them Foo Fighters. The Germans called them Kugelblitz. Both sides assumed they were secret weapons developed by the enemy. But after the war ended and intelligence files were compared, neither side could account for what pilots had seen. The phenomena remained unexplained. Naval encounters with unidentified objects are rarer but not unheard of. Sailors have reported strange lights beneath the surface. Sonar contacts that move impossibly fast or change depth in ways that violate what we understand about physics. Some of these reports come from reliable witnesses, experienced officers, trained observers, people who know the difference between a whale and something genuinely anomalous. Could Bismarck's final moments have involved such an encounter? It sounds absurd until you consider the circumstances. The ship was dying in the middle of the Atlantic. British forces were converging from multiple directions. The area would have been a hotspot of activity. If something unknown operated in those waters, this would have been the moment it might appear. The officer's note about shadows that are not ours takes on a different meaning in this context. Not German, not British, not anything recognizable. But there's another possibility that's even stranger. The Bismarck is a grave. Over 2,000 men died when that ship went down. Most of them drowned in the freezing Atlantic or were trapped inside as the vessel sank. Their bodies are still there, entombed in the wreck. Some divers and researchers who have visited the site report feelings that are hard to explain, a sense of being watched, a heaviness in the air that has nothing to do with pressure. The wreck feels haunted, not in a Hollywood horror movie way, in a deeper, more primal way, as if the trauma of what happened there has somehow imprinted itself on the location. Could the shadows in the water have been something paranormal? The officer was facing death. He was in an altered state of consciousness that people throughout history have associated with glimpses beyond the normal world. Deathbed visions are well documented. People in their final moments often report seeing things others cannot see: deceased loved ones, angels, lights, presences that come to guide them across the threshold. What if the officer, standing on the bridge of a sinking ship surrounded by dying men, caught a glimpse of something that exists in that liminal space between life and death? What if the shadows weren't in the water at all but somewhere else entirely? This explanation asks us to accept things that science cannot measure or prove, but it also resonates with human experience across cultures and centuries. The dying sometimes see things the living cannot. And in that moment, standing on the deck of the Bismarck as it slipped beneath the waves, perhaps that officer saw something that transcended the physical battle happening around him. Or perhaps he saw nothing at all. Perhaps the shadows were exactly what the rational mind insists they must be: stress-induced hallucinations from a man facing death. The truth is, we'll never know for certain. The officer who wrote those words died minutes after recording them. The notebook survived but offered no further explanation, and the mystery remains sealed at the bottom of the Atlantic, guarded by darkness and pressure and time. What the Bismarck teaches us. The story of the Bismarck matters for reasons that go beyond World War II history. Yes, it confirms that the ship was scuttled by its own crew, settling a decades-long historical debate. Yes, it showcases the incredible advances in deep-sea exploration that allow us to visit wrecks at crushing depths and document them in extraordinary detail. But the real reason this story matters is what it reveals about the nature of truth itself. We like to think that history is settled, that the big questions have clear answers, that events from 80 years ago are understood and documented and closed. But Bismarck proves otherwise. Here was one of the most famous naval battles of World War II. Thousands of men were involved. Both sides documented everything they could. Survivors gave detailed testimonies. Official reports were filed. And still, 8 decades later, we're discovering new information that changes the narrative. The notebook shouldn't have survived. By every law of physics and decomposition, it should be gone. But it's there. A voice from 1941 speaking directly to us, telling us things the official records never captured. And what that voice says raises more questions than it answers. The shadows in the water, what were they? We can theorize, we can speculate, we can apply logic and reason and the scientific method. But ultimately, we're confronted with uncertainty, with mystery, with the uncomfortable reality that some things cannot be neatly explained or categorized or filed away. This discomfort is important. It reminds us that human experience is larger than human understanding, that there are spaces in our knowledge where strange things exist, where the impossible sometimes happens, where the line between what we know and what we believe becomes blurred. The Bismarck's wreck is now protected as a war grave. Diving to the site is restricted. The ship and the men entombed within it are meant to rest undisturbed. This is appropriate and respectful, but it also means that many questions will remain forever unanswered. We cannot retrieve the notebook for more detailed analysis. We cannot excavate the wreck looking for additional clues. The mysteries are locked in place, 3 miles down, where darkness and pressure keep secrets better than any vault. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some stories are meant to remain unfinished. Maybe the purpose of the Bismarck's tale isn't to provide answers, but to remind us that there are still unknowns in the world, still places where human certainty fails, still moments in history where something strange occurred and we simply have to accept that we may never fully understand it. The shadows in the water weren't ours. That's what the officer wrote. And perhaps the most honest response we can give is simple acknowledgement. We don't know what he saw. We don't know what it meant. And that's okay. Not every mystery needs to be solved. Not every question needs an answer. Sometimes the value is in the wondering itself, in staying curious, in accepting that the world is larger and stranger than we usually admit. The Bismarck reminds us of this. It sits on the ocean floor, a monument to human ambition and human folly, a technological marvel that sank after just 8 days of operation, a symbol of power that ultimately proved how fragile power really is. And within its rusted halls, preserved by accident and impossible luck, a message remains, a voice from the past, speaking across 80 years, telling us about shadows in the water, about things that weren't theirs, about mysteries that refuse to die even when everything else has long since returned to the deep. The Bismarck rests 3 miles beneath the Atlantic, silent and unbroken, yet its secrets refuse to sleep. Shadows in the water, messages lost to time, questions with no answers the ocean remembers differently than history. Somewhere down there, the story continues, waiting for those brave enough to search, curious enough to question, and patient enough to face the unknown. The truth is still out there, lingering in the depths, daring anyone who dares to follow it. Are you ready to seek what lies beneath?